If you have been enjoying our content, please consider subscribing to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
I stood on the front porch feeling the warmth of the sun on my face as Rex lay beside my son Jacob, his golden fur shining against the fading light of a crisp autumn day. Jacob sat in silence, his hearing aids barely visible as he signed to me, a string of words that made me smile a little. I had always been amazed by his resilience despite the silence he had to live with every day. He had learned to communicate in his own way, and with Rex by his side, his world had expanded. Rex was not just a dog, he was Jacob's lifeline, his companion who could understand him better than anyone else. But as I watched the two of them, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The sound of footsteps broke the tranquility, and I turned to see her approaching, her eyes fixed on me, with that infuriating gleam that only someone who thought they were untouchable could possess. Her name was Karen, and she was the HOA president of our neighborhood. I had seen her around before, always with that smug air of authority, as though the neighborhood revolved around her and her rules. The way she carried herself suggested she believed she could do whatever she wanted without any consequences. And it was clear from the way she was walking toward me that she thought the same of me. She stopped just a few feet away, her posture stiff as if she was already preparing for a confrontation. She glanced down at Rex, who was lying calmly at Jacob's feet, and then back at me, her lips curling into a tight smile. "Excuse me," she said, her voice thin and dismissive, "but you can't have that dog here." I blinked for a moment, confused by her words. "What do you mean I can't have him here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's a service dog. He's with my son who is hearing impaired. That's illegal, right?" She didn't even flinch as she spoke again. "I don't care what kind of dog it is, it's not allowed in this neighborhood. The HOA has rules and that dog doesn't meet them." I felt my blood run cold. There was no way she could be serious. I had lived here for years and I knew the rules as well as anyone else. Service animals were not only allowed, they were protected under federal law. "Ma'am, you're mistaken," I said, my voice growing firmer. "This dog is a service dog for my son. You can't just take him away." Her gaze didn't soften, instead it hardened as if she were some kind of judge passing down a sentence. "I don't care," she said bluntly. "The rules are clear. No dogs allowed unless they are registered with the HOA, and that one isn't. He's not welcome here." I felt the heat rise in my chest. I had dealt with difficult people before in my career as an animal rights attorney, but this was something else entirely. Karen had no right to dictate whether or not my son's service dog could be here, and yet here she was using her position in the HOA to push a rule that was not only unnecessary but unjust. I glanced at Jacob, who was looking up at me, confusion and worry flashing across his face. He didn't understand why this woman was causing trouble. All he knew was that Rex was his dog, his companion, his friend. Rex looked up too, his gentle brown eyes meeting mine as if asking what was going on. My heart broke a little at the sight. How could anyone be so cruel as to take away the one thing that helped my son navigate a world that often felt silent and isolating? "Ma'am," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and frustration. "You can't do this. You know the law. The Americans with Disabilities Act protects my son's right to have his service dog with him wherever he goes." She raised an eyebrow as if I were speaking a foreign language. "I don't care about your legal talk," she said dismissively. "This is my neighborhood and I make the rules. You'll have to take it up with the board." I felt the ground shift beneath me. She wasn't even trying to hide her contempt for both my son and me. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about power. She was using her position to bully us, to make us feel small. And it was working. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to control the rising anger within me. "We'll take it up with the board," I said through gritted teeth, "but I'm not going to let you get away with this." With that, she turned and walked away without another word, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as if she had already won. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, the weight of the injustice settling in. This wasn't just about a dog being taken away, this was about something much deeper. She was trying to strip away my son's independence and dignity just because she could. I knew I couldn't let this go. I couldn't let her win. But as I watched her disappear into the distance, a feeling of dread settled over me. What was I up against here? A woman who clearly thought she was above the law. And with the HOA backing her every move, it was clear I was in for a long fight. I bent down to Jacob's level, my heart aching as I saw the sadness in his eyes. "It's okay," I said softly, ruffling Rex's fur. "We'll get this figured out." But even as I spoke the words, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The fight for Rex wasn't just about reclaiming a dog, it was about standing up for what was right. And I wasn't going to let anyone push me around, not even Karen. As I headed inside to start planning my next move, I couldn't help but wonder how far Karen would go to make sure she kept control. Would she really stop at nothing to win? I had a feeling I hadn't seen anything yet. The next morning I sat at my desk in the dim light of my home office, reviewing the legal documents I had pulled together on my computer screen, but I couldn't focus. Karen's face kept popping into my mind, her smug smile, her condescending tone. I knew I needed to act quickly, but every time I thought about it, I felt a knot of frustration in my chest. I had dealt with the toughest animal rights cases, but this was different. This was personal. I rubbed my temples, trying to shake off the anger that had been building all night. Rex was more than just a dog, he was Jacob's constant companion. He had been with him through every doctor's appointment, every school presentation, every lonely night when the world felt too big and too silent. Taking Rex away from Jacob wasn't just illegal, it was cruel. And the fact that Karen thought she could get away with it made my blood boil. I opened my office door and found Jacob sitting at the kitchen table fiddling with his hearing aids. Rex lay at his feet, his head resting on Jacob's knee as if offering silent comfort. Jacob looked up at me, his face pale and worried. "Mom, will Rex be okay?" He signed carefully, his fingers slow and unsure. The sight of him made my heart. My son had already faced so much in his young life, but now he was being dragged into a battle he didn't deserve. I knelt down beside him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "Rex is fine, sweetheart," I said, my voice soft but firm. "No one is going to take him away from you, we'll make sure of that." But even as I spoke, I knew that reassurance was just a small comfort. The reality of what was happening was much bigger than any of us. Karen had power over the neighborhood, but she didn't understand the laws that protected people like Jacob and me. She didn't care either. She saw our struggle as an inconvenience. To her, we were just another problem to be swept aside. I turned back to my desk, my mind racing through potential legal strategies. I had fought for animal rights for years. I had seen the worst of people and the best, but nothing could have prepared me for this. No legal argument or case law would make Karen see reason. I needed to hit her where it would hurt the most. But how? The phone rang, and I jumped, slightly startled by the sound. I picked it up without looking at the caller ID. "Hello," I said, my voice steady. "Hi, this is Lisa from the HOA board." The voice on the other end said, "I'm just calling to confirm that we received your complaint about the service dog. We've scheduled a meeting for next Wednesday at 6 p.m. to discuss the matter." I froze. "You're going to hold a meeting about this?" I asked incredulously. "About whether or not a child with a disability can have his service dog?" "Well, the board feels it's necessary to review the HOA's rules before making any decisions," Lisa replied in a tone that was all too familiar. It was the same tone Karen had used, the "we're in charge here" tone, that made it clear they weren't about to back down. I exhaled sharply, trying to keep my cool. "I don't need a meeting," I said slowly. "The law is clear. My son's service dog is legally protected. You don't need to review anything. You just need to follow the law." There was a pause on the other end before Lisa spoke again. "We'll discuss it at the meeting. I suggest you come prepared." The call ended before I could say anything more. I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of dread settle in my stomach. This wasn't going to be a simple legal matter. This was a battle of wills, and I was up against an opponent who believed she could do whatever she wanted with no consequences. I stood up and walked over to Jacob and Rex, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Karen wasn't just some neighbor who had crossed a line. She was a person with power and influence within the HOA, and that made her dangerous. She was used to getting what she wanted, and she wasn't going to let some animal rights attorney and her hearing-impaired son stop her. "Mom," Jacob signed, his face full of concern. What happens if they take Rex away? I swallowed hard, struggling to hold back the tears that threatened to rise. They won't take him away, I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure how to keep that promise. I'll fight for you, Jacob. I won't let anyone take Rex from you. Jacob nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. He had seen enough of the world to know that things didn't always work out the way they should. I hated that I had to drag him into this fight, but there was no turning back now. I spent the rest of the day gathering evidence, making calls to legal experts, and drafting a strategy. I knew I had to be smart. I couldn't just charge in and hope for the best. If I was going to win, I had to outmaneuver Karen at every turn. It wasn't just about proving she was wrong. It was about exposing her as the bully she was and making sure everyone saw it. By the time the meeting rolled around, I was ready. I walked into the HOA community center, my head held high as I scanned the room. Karen was sitting at the front of the room, her eyes narrowing when they landed on me. She knew this wasn't going to be easy for her. The meeting was long and drawn out, each member of the board looking at me with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Karen sat silently, her arms crossed, her face a mask of calm. I could feel her sense of superiority, but I also saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was time to strike. The board meeting dragged on with the typical small talk and unimportant discussions about landscaping and community events, but I was focused entirely on the matter at hand. Karen's smug face sitting at the front of the room made me burn with anger every time I looked at her. She had tried to make this about rules and regulations, but I knew better. This was about power and control, and her desperate need to assert her dominance over anyone who dared challenge her. I stood up when my turn, came calmly walking to the front of the room. The gaze of every member of the board on me felt like 1,000 eyes weighing me down, but I didn't flinch. I had dealt with high-pressure situations before. I had been in courtrooms with more at stake than this, but this was personal. This was my son's right to live freely in a world that too often saw him as less than. I cleared my throat before I spoke. I'm here today because Karen and the HOA are attempting to violate federal law. I said, my voice steady but strong. My son Jacob has a hearing impairment, and he needs his service dog Rex to help him navigate a world that is silent to him without Rex. Jacob would be isolated and vulnerable, so yes, I'm asking for your help in ensuring that Rex can remain here and continue to do his job as a service animal. There was a long pause before Karen spoke up, her voice sharp and cold. This dog is not a registered service dog with the HOA, she said, looking around the room as though her words were gospel, and therefore he shouldn't be allowed to stay. I took a deep breath, keeping my emotions in check. You're wrong, I replied calmly. The law is clear. A service dog doesn't need to be registered with an HOA, and you are required by law to make reasonable accommodations for my son's disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act guarantees his right to have Rex with him wherever he goes. I could see the doubt in the eyes of some of the board members, but Karen wasn't having it. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with contempt. I don't care about your legal talk, she sneered. My concern is about the rules that govern this community, and I won't let you use your son's disability as a shield to break them. It was a cruel blow designed to twist the knife to make me feel like a villain for even daring to ask for what was rightfully ours. I could feel the weight of her words trying to sink in, but I wasn't going to let her win. Not like this. I leaned in slightly, my eyes never leaving hers. You think this is about the rules, I said, my voice low and controlled. But it's not. This is about a mother trying to protect her child from someone who doesn't understand the meaning of compassion or respect for the law. You're not just attacking me, Karen, you're attacking every disabled person who needs help just to live a normal life. I could see her shift uncomfortably, but she didn't back down. Instead, she smirked as if she were untouchable. You're wasting your time, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The board has already made up its mind. I felt a rush of anger rise up my throat, but I swallowed it back. I knew I couldn't lose my cool. Not now. Not when I was so close to turning this around. I turned to the board members. You've heard the law, I said. You've heard Karen's attempts to distort it. Now I ask you to look at the reality of the situation. My son deserves the right to live. without fear of being separated from his service dog. I ask you to do the right thing and vote to allow Rex to stay. There was a tense silence in the room. As the board members exchanged uneasy glances, I could see that some of them were beginning to waver. They weren't sure where they stood anymore, and I knew this was my moment. I straightened up. I don't want to make this a bigger issue than it already is, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. But if you force me to take legal action, I will. And believe me when I say that I will not hesitate to expose everything about Karen's conduct in this community. It's not just about Rex anymore, it's about holding people like Karen accountable for the harm they cause. Karen's face turned bright red with fury, but I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. She hadn't expected this. I wasn't just playing by the rules, I was playing to win, and I wasn't afraid to drag her name through the mud if it came to that. Finally, one of the board members cleared his throat. I think we need to take a vote, he said, his voice uncertain. All in favor of allowing the dog to stay. The room was silent for a moment before a few hands slowly went up one by one until the majority of the board members had voted in favor of Rex staying. It was a victory, but it wasn't a complete one, not yet. Karen's face twisted in outrage as she glared at the board members. This isn't over, she spat through gritted teeth. You've made a mistake and I'll make sure you regret it. I could feel the weight of her words, but they didn't scare me. Anymore, I had won this round, and I would make sure to keep fighting until I had secured my son's right to live with dignity and freedom. As I left the meeting, I felt a small sense of triumph. But I knew this was just the beginning. Karen wouldn't stop with a simple defeat. She would come at me again and again, trying to make me back down, but I wasn't going anywhere. Not while my son needed me. Not while I still had a chance to make sure that no one would ever be allowed to treat him like less than. Jacob and Rex were waiting for me when I returned home, and as soon as I saw them, my heart swelled with pride. I had fought for them, and I had won, but I knew the fight was far from over, and I was ready for whatever came next. The next few days felt like an unrelenting storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The HOA board had voted in favor of Rex staying, but Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She had already started gathering her allies behind closed doors, whispering rumors and spreading half-truths to anyone who would listen. But I wasn't afraid. I had seen worse in my career as an animal rights attorney. I had fought battles that seemed impossible, and won every time. This was no different. But as the days wore on, I could feel the tension growing. Jacob started having trouble sleeping. His nightmares were back, and Rex stayed by his side, constantly sensing the unease in the air. I tried my best to reassure him, telling him that everything was going to be okay. But deep down, I knew that the war was far from over. Then one afternoon, I received an unexpected call. It was from the local news station. The reporter on the other end sounded eager. We've heard about the situation with your son's service dog, and we're interested in covering the story, she said. We believe it's important to bring attention to the way the HOA is treating you and your family. I had to think for a moment. The thought of putting everything out in the public eye was risky. It could backfire. Karen would spin it into a personal attack on her and the HOA, but I knew it was the only way to put enough pressure on them to make sure they wouldn't retaliate against us. I'll do it, I said, my voice steady. But I want it to be clear that this isn't just about me. This is about every person with a disability who has been made to feel less than for asking for basic accommodations. I want to make sure this story highlights that. The reporter agreed immediately, and we set up the interview for the following morning. Jacob was nervous about being on camera, but I promised him it would be okay, that we were doing this for him, and for anyone else who had been treated unfairly because of their disability. The next day, we stood in front of our house. Rex by Jacob's side as the camera crew set up. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The entire neighborhood would see this, they would hear our side of the story, and I hoped that it would be enough to turn the tide. The interview began with the reporter asking about our situation, and I spoke confidently about the law and the need for accommodations for service animals. But when the reporter turned to Jacob and asked how Rex had helped him, the emotion in his voice took me by surprise. Rex is my friend. Jacob signed his hands, shaking slightly. He helps me when I can't hear the cars or the sirens. He helps me feel safe. I felt a lump form in my throat watching Jacob speak so openly. His vulnerability made me want to protect him even more fiercely. But it also made me realize something that I had missed in all my planning. I had been so focused on the legal battle, the strategy, the tactics, that I had forgotten what this was really about. It wasn't about winning or losing in court. It was about making sure Jacob could live his life the way he deserved to. The reporter looked, moved by Jacob's words, and asked a few more questions before wrapping up the interview. I could see the wheels turning in her mind as she thought about how to frame the story, but I knew that no matter what she decided to do, we had already won, something that couldn't be taken away. Later that afternoon, as we sat in the living room watching the news segment air, I could feel a shift in the air outside the window. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke. Karen appeared at our doorstep, her face red with fury, her eyes blazing with hatred. "You think you've won," she spat, "but you're nothing but a liar and a cheat." I stood up slowly, my body tense with adrenaline. "Karen, you need to leave," I said, my voice cold and firm. "You've already lost." Her lip curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that," she hissed. "I'll make sure your precious dog is gone. You can't stop me." I was done with words. I was done with reasoning with someone who couldn't understand compassion. I opened the door wide enough to step outside and close it behind me, locking it firmly. "You don't scare me, Karen," I said softly, but with absolute certainty. "You've underestimated me and my son, and we're not going anywhere." Her face turned an alarming shade of red as she sputtered with rage, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of engaging any longer. I turned my back on her and walked back into the house. That night, as I tucked Jacob into bed, Rex curled up beside him, his breathing steady and calm. I watched the light from the street lamp outside cast shadows on the walls, and I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I had fought hard to get to this point, but it was Jacob's bravery that had carried us through it all. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Karen's attempts to silence us only made the backlash stronger. People from all over the community reached out with messages of support and outrage. Even some members of the HOA board privately admitted that they regretted their earlier stance. Karen's reputation had taken a hit, and no amount of anger or threats would change that. And then the final blow came when the HOA was forced to issue a public apology for their actions and a formal statement in support of Jacob's right to keep Rex as his service animal. The victory was sweeter than I had imagined, not just for us, but for every person who had ever been denied their basic rights. Due to ignorance or prejudice, Karen never spoke to us again after that day. She avoided eye contact when we passed her on the street, and I knew that she had been permanently exposed for the bully she was, but I didn't need her validation. As I watched Jacob and Rex play in the backyard, I couldn't help but smile. This was the life I had fought for them, for us. And it was worth every moment of struggle, every ounce of energy I had poured into the fight, because in the end, we had won not just a battle, but our right to live with dignity and respect.